for Matt. I've got to open the appropriate thing here. Give me a second. Oh, I'm missing it. Okay, sorry. Matt, if you wouldn't mind, please introduce yourself and we can get
Yeah,
started.
not a problem. First off, before I dive into introducing myself, I just want to thank the STLE's Toronto section here for the opportunity to talk, to specifically call out Ken Brown, thank him for this opportunity, for inviting me. Thank you all for choosing to spend some time with me this morning, especially those of you on the West Coast who are up a little earlier than some of the rest of us. So, just a little background on myself. I work at EPT Clean Oil. We'll talk a little bit more about what EPT does a slide or two from now. But I've been here managing our Fluid Technical Center, managing our research and development program for almost 9 years now. And before that, I managed a national commercial oil analysis lab in Canada. And in a previous lifetime before that, I did my PhD in synthetic chemistry at the University of Calgary. So that's who I am. And yeah, today, as you can see, hopefully the title slide, Lubricant Oil Varnish Detection and Remediation. Perhaps not the catchiest title, but I put a little subtitle in here, the soluble-insoluble varnish equilibrium, because we're going to spend a fair bit of time discussing that, because that equilibrium really has important implications on both varnish detection and varnish remediation. So we're going to get into that in a fair bit more detail. All right, so, I've introduced myself briefly. I'll just, introduce located out west here in Canada, in Calgary. Not quite as far west as Ray, but just on the other side of the beautiful Canadian Rockies. So this is one of the reasons I love working at EPT Clean Oil is I get to live in Calgary and I get to look out the window and see those snow-capped peaks about an hour's drive away, and they make it a great place to be if you like getting out hiking, skiing, mountaineering, camping like I do. Now, apart from that proximity to the mountains, we specialize in ion exchange-based lubricant treatments. And we've been doing this for over a quarter of a century now. And over the course of that time, EPT's products have been installed at thousands of sites where we've provided end users with over $100 million in peer-reviewed, proven cost savings. Now, apart from living close to the mountains, another thing that I really like about working at EPT Clean Oil is there's really a commitment to science here. We really focus on our research and development program. We have our own oil analysis lab that I've been involved in building from the ground up. And it's not just an oil analysis lab, it's really a world-class R&D facility that we're very proud to have built here. And the goal of this is, of course, to advance our own product line, but more generally, to advance the science of lubricant management. And, like from my background, I had a PhD or did a PhD in synthetic chemistry. So science is something that I'm just generally passionate about. And this is the reason that we present webinars like this, that we are active with organizations like the STLE, active with ASTM, with ICML, because, getting these results are only good if you share those results. To drive the science forward, you have to share what you're doing. And that's exactly what I hope to do here today with you all. Okay, so without further ado, we're here to talk about varnish, so I'd best introduce the topic. Many people will have probably sat through a varnish introduction before. Please bear with me if you have. We'll get to some more interesting different things a slide or two from now, but just to get everyone on the same page. So what is varnish and how does it form? Why is it a problem? Well, the vast majority of the lubricants that we use are hydrocarbon based, whether it be a group 1, a group 2, a group 3, or a group 4 base oil. Those are all hydrocarbon based and therefore non-polar. Now, when you put those oils into service, they undergo breakdown and most likely oxidative breakdown because we live under an oxygen atmosphere. And that breakdown produces polar oxidation products. So when you think about solubility, this might bring you back to a freshman chemistry class or something like that. Probably heard a prof or a TA at some point say like dissolves like. So when we think about our nonpolar oils and the polar breakdown products that form from them, those two are not alike. So you would anticipate that those would have limited or poor solubility together. And that is in fact the case. And it is the cause of widespread varnish problems, this poor solubility of the oil's breakdown products in the oil itself. So how do we define varnish? The best definition that I've found is from ASTM D7843. That's the MPC test method, which we'll talk about in more detail later, of course, as we discuss varnish detection. And it defines varnish as a thin, hard, lustrous, oil-insoluble deposit, one which is composed primarily of organic residue. And you can see an example of some varnish on a valve on the right of the slide there. Now, one thing to note about this varnish, this organic residue, these oil breakdown products, they've been formed by chemical breakdown of the lubricant. As I mentioned previously, most often oxidation. And as a chemical change, this is something that is irreversible. And when we're speaking to oxidation, also something that is unfortunately unavoidable. I mean, oxygen's in the air all around us. And in terms of thermodynamics, it's a very downhill reaction. So it does not go back the other way once it's gone. Now, that's a good definition of varnish, but it's missing out on a key varnish property. It really focuses on the end result of varnish, this insoluble deposit. And it's these insoluble deposits that really lead to most of the problems. So it's understandable why they get all the attention. But this definition omits the fact that insoluble varnish actually begins its life cycle as an oil-soluble breakdown product, something that is dissolved in the fluid. So oil goes into service, it undergoes oxidation or some other form of breakdown, and this forms soluble or dissolved varnish, varnish precursors, etc. And these can then go on to convert to insoluble varnish. And the important part to realize about this conversion is that this is often a physical process and is therefore reversible, unlike the chemical change that led to the formation of soluble varnish. And the reversibility of this soluble-insoluble varnish kind of shapeshifter, this reversibility has important implications for varnish removal technologies. And we'll discuss these as the presentation goes on. Okay, so why do we care about varnish? Why do we care if it's soluble, insoluble, what it is? Well, the reason that we care is it has a well-established detrimental impact on the performance and reliability of critical industrial equipment. And we tend to focus in on gas turbines when we're talking about this, because it can cause valves to stick, and that can lead to a unit trip or a failed start condition. And obviously, this is very costly because when you're looking at the revenues that are associated with power generation, they're significant. So if the turbine goes down unexpectedly because of a trip for 12 or 24 hours, that's a significant loss. But that's not the only problem that varnish causes, and turbine applications aren't the only industrial application where there are issues. Other problems, things like filter plugging, reduced clearances because you have deposits forming. That can lead to increased temperatures, which is also going to promote more oil breakdown, so it can make things worse, kind of a vicious circle. It can lead to increased wear as well. If that varnish coats out on cooler surfaces, you're going to have reduced delta T. So we've seen situations where end users had a cooler and they had to derate their turbine's performance because they weren't able to cool the oil down enough because of varnish deposited out in that cooler. So you can see this goes well beyond valves. So it is a significant issue in a number of applications. How prevalent is it? Well, again, it's quite prevalent, going way back to 2005 now. GE, who are the largest manufacturer of gas turbines in the world, they released a TIL, or Technical Information Letter, for their users, and that stated that all gas turbine users are expected to have varnish-related problems over time. So we often run into the objection to, varnish removal systems and varnish testing from end users who say, I don't have a varnish problem. I've never had a varnish problem. Well, you're on borrowed time. In all likelihood, GE, like I said, they've stated that all of gas turbine users are expected to experience a varnish-related problem over time. So it is a significant issue. It is a prevalent issue. So how do we understand, how big an issue this is in our specific application if we are operating a turbine, for instance? Well, fortunately, tribologists methods to look at a lubricant's potential for forming harmful varnish deposits. And we're of course talking about membrane patch colorimetry, which is a bit of a and this is a test method that, despite its somewhat complicated name, it's actually a really simple test. It's a patch test. We're taking an oil sample, diluting it with a nonpolar solvent, and passing it through a 0.45 micron lab filter patch. And when you do that, if there is insoluble varnish present, you can detect that varnish. It leaves behind a residue or stain on the patch. So you can see some examples on the right-hand side of the slide there. On the left, we have a fluid that's in reasonably good condition. There was no stain left behind on this patch. There was no varnish in this fluid. So you have a fluid in good condition, a low varnish potential. As you have fluids that have more and more varnish that has accumulated in them, the intensity of the color of that stain that's left behind on the patch gets darker and darker. And you can see that in the examples further to the right. Now, for the purposes of the test method, so that we can quantify the intensity of that color and we can trend the data going forward, we use a spectrophotometer to measure the delta E value, and this is the color intensity. So a higher delta E value is a darker patch, and this is indicative of a higher potential for varnishing. Now, many users are familiar with the broad strokes of the MPC test as I have just presented them. But one thing that a lot of people aren't familiar with are some of the finer points of the test. And these include the fact that consistent sample preparation is really, really important for this test method to ensure that you get meaningful and reproducible results. So what prep steps am I talking about specifically? I'm talking about the need upon receipt in the lab for an oil sample to be heated to 60 degrees Celsius, for 24 hours. And then after that heating period, to be incubated in the dark at room temperature for 72 hours. So it's really important to follow these steps. And the reason that it's important to follow these steps, and we'll follow this up with kind of some examples on later slides, but this is a patch test. We are detecting insoluble varnish. So oil samples are a little bit unusual in the way that varnish behaves because soluble and insoluble varnish exist in an equilibrium, which we'll discuss extensively throughout the course of this presentation. When you take an oil sample, if you let that sit on your desk for a day, a week, who knows how long, the varnish potential of the fluid can change because some of that soluble varnish in the fluid can begin to convert to insoluble varnish. And again, it's this insoluble varnish that we're capturing on a filter patch. So this is what's detectable. So the heating step, it is intended to kind of reset samples when they are received by a lab. Because again, I've seen samples that literally arrive in our Fluid Technical Center hot from the turbine. They've been drawn within the hour. And I've seen other samples. This one's an extreme example, but I saw a sample from 2018 that just arrived last month. I have no idea how long that's been sitting on someone's desk and shipping or who knows what. But you know, in the average case, I'd say it's not uncommon for a sample to take 2 weeks to arrive at our lab. And over the course of that time, some of the soluble varnish that's present in that fluid, it starts to precipitate out as insoluble varnish. So if you don't reset the sample, you could get a false high result on your MPC varnish potential. You reset the oil sample, you break up some of that varnish that has crashed out, you redissolve it into the fluid, and then the important part, the really important part, you let it sit for 72 hours because this gives each and every oil sample around the world the same finite amount of time for that insoluble soluble varnish equilibrium to reestablish and for some of that insoluble varnish to come out and be detectable. Why 72 hours? Well, it's somewhat arbitrary, but because ASTM D7843 says so, really. You could do it for 48 hours, you'd get lower varnish results in general. You could do it for 96 hours, you'd get higher varnish results in general, because you'd give more time for insoluble varnish to come out. 72 hours, just important that we all do things consistently. So we're always comparing apples to apples. And this 72-hour hold time is actually really important. The MPC test method, D7843, requires that it be reported alongside the delta E result, because as I've kind of alluded to here, that delta E result can change very much depending on whether you go, 48 hours, 72 hours like you're supposed to, or 96 hours, anything else, for instance. And we see a lot of commercial labs, unfortunately, that are not reporting this 72-hour hold time. So I'd take a look at your oil analysis reports, after the talk today, and take a look at your last delta E result. If there's no 72 hours next to that, I'd call out your lab on that because they are not compliant with the MPC test method if they're not reporting the 72-hour hold time. Why is it so important? We have an example at the bottom of this slide. Believe it or not, the two patches shown in this table are the exact same oil sample. The top patch, it looks white. It looks like there's no varnish in this fluid at all. But that patch was prepared without the required 72-hour period. So this oil didn't have time for insoluble varnish to come out of it and to be detectable on a patch. If you give that exact same oil sample the time to do so, you let it sit for 72 hours, you get a very different result. So you can see that your MPC varnish potential is 22 versus 3. So again, if this is my turbine that this sample is taken from, the maintenance actions that I'm looking at taking, they differ greatly dependent on which of these two patch results I look at. So you want to make sure that the lab is doing things right, that they are letting that oil sit for 72 hours and reporting that 72-hour hold time. Okay, so the reason that 72-hour hold time is so important is because varnish is a shapeshifter. It exists in a soluble state, it exists in an insoluble state. And like any other two states of matter that are related, they exist in dynamic equilibrium with one another. So we're getting into some freshman chemistry here again. What that means is it means that the relative amount of soluble varnish versus insoluble varnish in any system is dependent on a balance, an equilibrium between those two states. And the dynamic part of that equilibrium means that those two states are constantly interconverting. So soluble varnish is constantly forming insoluble varnish and vice versa. It's going back and forth. But at equilibrium, there's a balance and there's no net change in the amount of either. So that no net change in the amount of either, that means that every equivalent of soluble varnish that precipitates out at equilibrium is balanced by an equivalent of insoluble varnish, which goes back into the oil. Now, this is where things get tricky. That's under constant conditions. Things like to establish equilibria under constant conditions because equilibrium is the most thermodynamically stable state in which that system can exist. And all systems strive to get to the most thermodynamically, lowest energy state. That's under constant conditions. When conditions change, Le Chatelier's principle tells us that equilibria will shift to reestablish a new balance, one which is more thermodynamically favorable under the new set of conditions. So that's all a little bit heady. We probably glossed over a few I's there, talking about freshman thermodynamics this early in the morning. So at this point, I'd like to take a little bit of a step back from talking about soluble and insoluble varnish and to present an everyday example to put this in a bit better perspective. Because again, it's really important to understand equilibria in order to understand the implications that they're going to have on varnish detection and removal. So our everyday example, let's consider, for instance, a glass of water on the desk in front of you. Now, intuitively, we all know that the majority of the water in that glass is in the liquid state. But we also know that there is water vapor in the air above the surface of the liquid there. And that water vapor and that liquid water, they are in dynamic equilibrium with one another. So on the bottom left, we've got this kind of cartooned out. You can see that we have liquid water evaporating at a rate equal to that which the water vapor is condensing. The system is at equilibrium. So there's no net change in the amount of either, but they are constantly interconverting on the molecular level. That's under constant conditions. What happens if we change those conditions? If we increase temperature, for instance, Le Chatelier's principle tells us we are going to shift that equilibrium. And intuitively, again, we all know that as you increase the temperature, we're going to have more liquid water evaporating. And you can see that cartooned out in the middle. We have more liquid water molecules escaping into the gaseous phase. Now, the system is no longer at equilibrium, but eventually what's going to happen is as more and more liquid water evaporates, we're going to see the water vapor becoming more and more concentrated above the liquid surface. And eventually we reach this sort of a critical point where the water vapor has become concentrated enough that two water molecules in the gas phase are more likely to run into one another. When they do, condensation occurs. So we start to see slowly but surely the rate of condensation starts to catch up to the increased rate of evaporation until such a time as we establish a new equilibrium, which you can see on the right. So again, now we have no net change in the amount of either liquid or vapor. But the net impact of changing conditions, of increasing temperature here, has been to shift the equilibrium to favor the gaseous state. And it is a general thermodynamic truth that as you increase temperatures, you are going to favor more dispersed states of matter. The corollary is also true. As you decrease temperatures, you're going to favor more condensed states of matter. So as this relates to varnish, our soluble-insoluble varnish equilibrium, soluble varnish is obviously the dispersed state. It will be favored at higher temperatures. Insoluble varnish, it doesn't get any more condensed than a solid. That is our condensed state, favored at lower temperatures. So again, we have this cartooned out showing the impact of temperature change on the soluble-insoluble varnish equilibrium. Consider at left, we have in red insoluble varnish, kind of as part of a varnish deposit, and floating above it in the oil in pink, the dispersed state, soluble varnish. So consider it bearing temperature. This should be as hot as the oil's getting in a turbine, for instance, about 120 C in a gas turbine application. So at the bearing, we have an equilibrium established between soluble and insoluble varnish. You can see that equilibrium is dynamic. The two forms are interconverting, but we don't have any net change in the amount of either until our conditions begin to change. As that fluid moves away from the bearing, it tends to cool. Now, cooling that fluid is going to favor the formation of the condensed state. And so what you end up seeing as the fluid moves its way back to reservoir temperature, say 40 degrees Celsius, is you see a new equilibrium established. So the net impact of cooling this oil down as it moves away from the bearing has been to shift the soluble-insoluble varnish equilibrium to favor the formation of insoluble varnish. And this is the reason that we so often see varnish forming in cooler regions of systems. Because when you move that varnish there, varnish that was dissolved at a warmer temperature is more likely to crash out and to form a potentially harmful deposit. Okay, so I like those cartoons for illustrating things, but I think the video here provides a much more compelling demonstration of that. We'll just cue it up real quick. We've got two beakers of in-service oil. This is the exact same in-service oil sample. They've been heated up to about 50 degrees Celsius here. On the left, you can see the sample as found, as taken from the turbine. On the right, same oil sample, but we've now removed the soluble varnish from it. And we'll talk about how you can do that later in the presentation. So let's see what happens under constant conditions here. You know, the system's obviously at equilibrium, but let's see what happens as we begin to cool the oil sample down. You'll note they both look clear and bright when they're warm because any varnish that is present is dissolved. You can't see it. You can see the thermometer through both beakers. That's important because as we begin to cool more and more, you can see that the beaker on the left, which had soluble varnish in it, becomes hazier and cloudier, and eventually it becomes altogether opaque. So what's going on here? It's exactly what we've just talked about. It's Le Chatelier's principle at work. We're changing conditions, cooling the oil sample down, and in doing so, we're shifting the equilibrium to favor the insoluble form of varnish. Beaker on the right doesn't change because there was no soluble varnish in it, so there is no possibility of generating insoluble varnish from that beaker. On the left, where there was soluble varnish present, as the oil cools, we form fine varnish particles as the varnish precipitates out of the oil. Those fine particles actually scatter light, and they result in this sort of opaque, hazy-looking oil that we see there. Okay, so we've talked about the soluble-insoluble varnish equilibrium and what impact it has on varnish detection. Let's go ahead and take a look at the impacts that it has on varnish removal or varnish remediation, because this was the other subtopic of today's presentation. So obviously, if you're operating a turbine or any other critical industrial equipment, it's important that you have a strategy in place for maintaining your fluid, for ensuring that varnish doesn't become an issue for you. In gas turbines, for instance, varnish is the most common cause of oil-related failures. So you're going to want to make sure you have a strategy in place to remove varnish, either after it's formed or as it forms. And generally, there are three different strategies that are kind of widely at your disposal these days. The first involves the use of a polyalkylene glycol, or a PAG, as a sort of cleaning agent for your fluid. And sometimes these are used to clean up systems as they're dirty. Sometimes they are put into oils as additives in an attempt to make sure that varnish stays dissolved and doesn't crash out. But they operate on the same principle regardless. Next, we're going to look at particle removal systems, and these are quite likely the most common varnish removal systems. They function on the basis that they remove insoluble varnish. And the third strategy, which we're going to present, involves soluble varnish removal. So this is attacking varnish at its earliest stage. And you can do this by using well-selected ion exchange resins. At EPT Clean Oil, our trade name for our ion exchange resins is ICB, and these have been specifically engineered for lubricant applications. So let's look at each of these strategies one by one in a little bit more detail and try to understand, what impact they have on that soluble-insoluble varnish equilibrium so that we can understand the pros and cons of each. So that first strategy involves the use of a polyalkylene glycol, essentially to clean systems and to keep varnish dissolved. And the reason that PEGs do this is that they incorporate oxygen into every third position along their polymer backbone, as you can see on the right. The impact of this is that they're quite polar molecules. And if you can engineer the PEG in such a way that it is miscible with the nonpolar oil, but it itself is polar, then this ends up creating a situation where you kind of have a middleman for varnish. Varnish is polar, the oils are nonpolar, so the two don't like to get along. But if you can have a PEG kind of in the middle to marry both that polarity and that non-polarity, it can help you to keep more varnish in solution. But if you're going to use a PEG like this, the use of it will rely on two key assumptions. The first assumption is that varnish that is in solution is dissolved, does no harm. And the second solution, and the one that is perhaps even more dangerous, is that varnish which is dissolved and in solution will stay there. So at EPT Clean Oil, we like to test things for ourselves. We've seen a lot of marketing on these PEGs. There are even PAG-based turbine oils, not additives, turbine oils. And a lot of these advertise themselves as being varnish-free. So we wanted to test to see, do these PEGs have any tendency to form varnish? And to do this, we took a virgin turbine oil and made a mixture with the PAG cleaning additive. And we made a 90-10 mixture, 90% turbine oil, 10% PAG. This is according to the guidelines of the PAG supplier. And we took this turbine oil PAG mixture and we degraded it on our test stand in our lab. And this is testing that we do quite often on turbine oils on their own, because at EPT, it's really our business to understand how turbine oils break down. So at this point, we've tested every major commercially available turbine oil on the North American market. We actually picked a turbine oil for the sake of this experiment, one that is very robust, one that does not break down easily, because we wanted to see what impact the PEG has on the best of the best, essentially. So you can see at time 0, the fluid's a little bit hazy. This suggests to me that at 10%, the PAG is not completely miscible with the turbine oil. It's reasonably miscible, but not perfect. But the MPC varnish potential is near 0. So what happens is we begin to heat that sample up and we bubble dry air through it in the presence of a copper catalyst. This is the same way we break down turbine oils. After 6 hours test time, only 6 hours on the test stand, we already had a critical MPC varnish potential. And you can see that the fluid has darkened pretty significantly over that time. Now, this was shocking to us because this turbine oil that we were testing, when we tested it on its own without the PEG cleaner additive in it, at 6 hours test time, it had an MPC of 3. With the PEG cleaner, it had an MPC delta E of 58, so a critical varnish potential. This is telling us that it's the PAG that's breaking down here to form the varnish that we're capturing on that patch. So that's a little bit worrying because, again, this is something that's marketed as a varnish solution. And in this instance, it looks like it's actually it's driving the formation of varnish. And this continues for 48 hours through 144 hours on the test stand. Varnish potential continues to increase. The fluid continues to darken. The darkest of those beakers, if you look really closely, it's hard to see on a slide, but there's actually a slurry of insoluble varnish and materials that's floating around in that flask. It's really quite awful looking. Now, an interesting thing happened. We left, to go home for the evening one day, and we came back the next morning, and the fluid looked completely different, and the varnish potential looked completely different as well. You can see suddenly overnight that fluid went from looking awful to being clear and bright, and the varnish potential dropped from a critical level to near 0. It looks almost like it did back at time 0. So initially we thought to ourselves, well, this is exactly what the PAG claimed it was going to do. It was going to bring that varnish back into solution. So does this product work? Well, as we examined some of the fluid's other properties, we came to understand what was actually going on here. This apparent improvement in fluid appearance, it happened to coincide with an acid number explosion in this system. Overnight, the fluid's acid number changed from 0.14 to 3.2, and acids are extremely polar species. So when these acids formed, they really ramped up the polarity of the fluid and drew a lot of that previously insoluble varnish back into solution. Now, you may say, okay, well, the varnish went into solution. That's all that matters. I'd argue that operating with an acid number in excess of 3 is going to be problematic, whether there's varnish there or not. So where did these acids come from? Well, again, like we saw with the varnish that we talked about previously that formed initially in this test, these acids come from the PEG additive because we know that this turbine oil on its own, it was stable. It didn't form an acid number above 0.07 until after 2,000 hours time on our breakdown test stand under the same conditions. So all of these acids are coming from the PEG, and the problem is they don't stop forming here. They continue to form, they continue to accumulate. The acid number ended up increasing from 3.2 all the way up to 30, and as breakdown products accumulate in the fluid, eventually it becomes saturated once more, and we see varnish crashing out once again. Okay, so this really highlights how PEG cleaners work. They change the oil's saturation point. They increase the amount of varnish that can be kept in a dissolved state. But alarmingly, the PEG itself can contribute to breakdown, and there's no magic bullet here. Eventually, as breakdown products accumulate, that fluid will become saturated once more, and you will have varnish problems. And what's really worrying with these PEG additives is that you can allow your fluid to hold a whole lot more varnish than it ever could before. So when that varnish starts to come out, it can have serious consequences because there's so much of it at this point. So the conclusion from this work is that PEG cleaners are potentially useful in their ability to redissolve varnish. But at best, what you're doing is you're kicking the problem down the line. You are deferring your varnish problem by increasing the fluid's saturation point. Now, there's a time and a place for this. I don't want to come across as being completely negative on this product. Say you have an outage in 3 months' time and you just need to get to that outage without a trip. You're going to replace the oil anyways. Then this might be a useful product for you in that instance, but I would not consider using it as a long-term solution. A short-term solution, potentially. Just another bit of an example here to show that PEGs, again, I do this because they're often marketed aggressively as being varnish-free products. They don't just form varnish in our test stand, they form varnish in the real world as well, unfortunately. So when you're looking at product data sheets, be aware that this is a marketing document, not a scientific document, and it should be regarded accordingly. This particular end user, they decided to replace their conventional turbine oil with a PEG-based turbine oil. They bought into the marketing, it was a varnish-free turbine oil, and they'd had varnish problems historically. So they switched out to PEG according to the oil manufacturer's guidelines. And imagine their surprise when 6 months later, they start finding gray deposits on things. And shortly after that time, they saw significant increases in acid number and viscosity as well. And when they opened up their system, they saw this sort of a gray sludge coating out everything. And they were perplexed because they just installed a varnish-free turbine oil 6 months ago. So what on earth is this? They sent a sample up to us at EPT Clean Oil so that we could analyze it. We did elemental analysis on that fluid by energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, elemental analysis on the sludge, sorry, not the fluid, just to determine its elemental composition. And you can see from the table on the left, this is 98.5% organic, carbon, oxygen, and sulfur. These all come from the fluid itself. The sulfur is part of the additive pack in this oil. So this is an organic residue, an insoluble sludge, which is formed from oil-derived breakdown products. By definition, this is varnish. So unfortunately, there are no varnish-free turbine oils. If something sounds too good to be true, there's a high likelihood that it is. Certainly, there are oils that are more resistant to varnish formation. But again, I take exception to aggressive marketing in the form of saying things that are varnish-free. Okay, so that's one strategy to avoid varnish, to mitigate the risks of varnishing using a PEG cleaner or even a PEG turbine oil itself. The next strategy which I want to talk about is filtration, and this is probably the most common strategy that we see employed. So this could be conventional filtration, it could be depth media filters, it could be electrostatic filtration. But the one thing that all of these technologies have in common is that they only remove insoluble varnish. And in this regard, I'd suggest that they're a half measure. They're an effective half measure as well. I'm never going to speak ill of filtration. It's obviously very well established that reliability increases with good filtration. You want to be removing varnish particles from your oil. You want to be removing dirt, dust, grit, nuts, bolts. All of these things are bad for your system. So filtration is very important in that regard. But it's a half measure when it comes to varnish because it doesn't really impact the soluble-insoluble varnish equilibrium. It removes insoluble varnish, which is already formed. But it has no impact on soluble varnish. It's dissolved. It flies right through sieve-type filters. And as a result, that soluble varnish is still free to form insoluble varnish elsewhere in a system if conditions change, if things cool down, for instance. So we've got a case study to kind of highlight two key concepts here, highlighting the fact that filtration-based solutions don't address soluble varnish, and highlighting the importance of that 72-hour hold time on the MPC test once more. So this end user was experiencing hydraulic actuator sticking. Their hydraulic actuator was sticking because of varnish. So they bought some varnish filters, high-efficiency filters that were marketed as being a solution to varnish. They installed those on-site, and they were actually equipped with an on-site, a portable MPC patch testing kit. These are available on the market. Like I said, the MPC test, it's not really rocket science, it's a patch test. So this is something you can do on-site. And they decided after they installed their high-efficiency filters, they wanted to pull an upstream oil sample, a downstream oil sample, and they passed it through a filter patch on-site to see what impact their high-efficiency filters had. Now you can see when you look at the pictures of the patches below, that upstream photo clearly has varnish in it. The downstream photo does not appear to have varnish in it. On this basis, it really looks like those high-efficiency filters that they installed are working very well. What's the issue here? They didn't let any of those samples sit for 72 hours like you have to. What happens when you do? Well, they sent duplicate samples off to their commercial lab to confirm the results, and imagine their surprise when they came back completely different. So what is going on here? The patch on the top right, this white patch, why isn't there any varnish on it when 72 hours later, if you let it sit for that 72-hour period, there is? Well, because the varnish that we're detecting is insoluble varnish. That is the detectable form of varnish on a lab filter patch. And this is taken immediately downstream of a high-efficiency filter, which is essentially a large-scale version of that same filter patch. So those high-efficiency filters, they effectively removed the insoluble varnish that was present in this oil. The problem was there was still soluble varnish left behind, and that soluble varnish isn't detectable unless you give it 72 hours to crash out. And if you do, as you are required to, you see the patch on the bottom right, which looks very different, a different MPC varnish potential altogether, because that's establish a new equilibrium, and you can detect the insoluble varnish that crashes out, excuse me. So the net conclusion from all of this, unfortunately, was that, obviously the high efficiency filters were removing any insoluble varnish which existed in solution, but they were leaving the soluble varnish behind. And when you look at the actual MPC results that the lab provided, there was a 0% improvement in the fluid's MPC varnish potential as a result of the high efficiency filtration on site. So this is telling us that the varnish potential here is really being driven by the soluble varnish component. So it's important to address that component. And to that end, we would recommend the use of ICB, ion exchange resins. Like I said, these have been engineered specifically for use in lubricant applications to remove varnish in its dissolved soluble state. And by doing so, you're actually able to interrupt the varnish cycle at its earliest stage. If you pull out these dissolved soluble varnish breakdown products as they form, well, they never have a chance to establish an equilibrium with their insoluble form, which causes all the problems. Now, another great thing about this technology is it actually indirectly addresses insoluble varnish. And the way that it does this is by exploiting the soluble-insoluble varnish equilibrium. By removing soluble varnish, recall that that interconversion process is a physical and reversible process. You can desaturate the oil, and when the oil becomes desaturated, it has some capacity to take previously deposited varnish back into solution. Once that's in solution, you can remove it as well. So we have this kind of cartooned out for you here, just to demonstrate how soluble varnish removal really is the only one that truly exploits the varnish equilibrium to clean varnish in both its forms. So on the far left, under number 1 there, we have a servo valve spool. It's kind of coated with golden varnish. Insoluble varnish we've shown as green dots here. Soluble varnish floating in the oil around the spool is shown as gray dots. And you can see that they are at equilibrium with one another. They are interconverting at an equal rate, no net change in the amount of either. What happens if you remove the soluble varnish that's present using an ion exchange resin, ICB resin, for instance? Well, you upset the equilibrium between soluble and insoluble varnish. And the only way that the system can respond to reestablish a new equilibrium, a new thermodynamically steady state or stable state, is if some of that insoluble varnish redissolves into the oil. And then you see the net impact of that in number 3. Our valve spool's a little bit lighter now, a little bit cleaner. There's less insoluble varnish on it. We have an equilibrium reestablished. But of course, we're continuously treating these fluids with the ICB ion exchange resin. So you can pull that soluble varnish that is now redissolved right back out. And when you do so, you upset the equilibrium again. And you can see how a positive feedback mechanism here, how that positive feedback mechanism drives the complete cleanup of the system. And I'd just like to show a little kind of 15-second video here, because I think that really reinforces what we were talking about here. Same servo valve spool. For the purposes of demonstration, soluble varnish, is shown as a gray dot in the fluid. Of course, you can't really see soluble varnish, but you have to show it somehow. So as that degrades, it darkens, you see more and more varnish accumulating, and you start to see that varnish precipitate out on the valve spool. It gets dirty, you see the varnish deposit forming. How do we fix that? You install an ion exchange filter. You remove the soluble varnish, which you can see has now been pulled out of the fluid. You can see the stream of fluid going into the ICB filter. Dirty, coming out is clean. What impact does that have on the soluble-insoluble varnish equilibrium? It upsets it. It forces that insoluble varnish to dissolve back into the oil. And once it's dissolved back into the oil, it can be removed from the oil, just like the soluble varnish was previously. So positive feedback to drive the cleanup of this altogether. Okay, so returning to our case study, this hydraulic actuator that was sticking and the high efficiency varnish filters that they installed on site unfortunately didn't work. The end user purchased a soluble varnish removal system at this time because they figured out what was going on, what was wrong. And you can see that the impact that that SVR had in the bottom row of our table. You can see that it removed the soluble varnish, which the high efficiency filters had left behind earlier. The patch on the bottom right there, it is white. It's got a low MPC varnish potential 3. This patch has been allowed to sit. This oil was allowed to sit for 72 hours as required. Over the course of that time, no insoluble varnish crashed out because there was no soluble varnish, or very little soluble varnish anyways, left behind in the fluid. Just like those 2 beakers we saw earlier on in the presentation. When there was no soluble varnish left, it doesn't really matter how long you let the oil sit. It does not matter how cool the oil gets. There's no soluble varnish left, so you don't reestablish that equilibrium with the insoluble varnish on that patch. So at the end of the day, an SVR filtration skid on this system was able to improve the varnish potential by 86%. And the most important soluble varnish removal isn't just effective for soluble varnish. It takes we have pictures from the inside of the same SGT 800 turbine here. You can see previous to the installation. On the right, you can see 3 to 6 months later, that varnish has been cleaned up because the soluble varnish removal has cleaned the oil, and that has allowed the oil to exploit the equilibrium to clean the system entirely. Again, this is kind of showing you what happens when you have soluble varnish removal and you install it on day 1. This is a new turbine oil being degraded on our lab test stand. We degraded it with and without soluble varnish removal. The white line is without, the black line is with. So with, as you degrade that oil, breakdown products accumulate, the MPC varnish potential increases, and you see the varnish on those patches on the bottom left. If you do this exact same experiment in the presence of soluble varnish removal using an ICB resin, you can see a very different result. The patches stay white. The MPC varnish potential stays near 0. An important thing to note about this black line on the plot and all these white patches at the bottom right, it's not that this oil isn't breaking down. This oil is breaking down the exact same way the other trial was breaking down. It's just that those breakdown products are never being allowed to accumulate. They are being removed continuously as they form. And by doing so, you prevent varnish from ever reaching levels where it could cause a problem. This is a real world case study showing the exact same thing. A lot of varnish removal case studies tend to focus, like we did earlier, on a patch that has a high varnish potential. You install my machine and then that patch turns white because I removed varnish. And that's a compelling case study. But I find that this one's even more compelling because this is really the case for preventative maintenance. What we've been talking about until now is really reactive maintenance. And we intuitively all know that reactive maintenance is not a great approach when you're dealing with critical equipment. But unfortunately, there is a kind of widespread resistance. People don't want to buy a varnish removal machine if they don't have a varnish problem. But this is the reason that you should. This is why preventative maintenance is better. This is it's actually now a 10-year-old gas turbine. You can see the first data point is 2011. I guess this slide is marginally outdated. So 10-year-old gas turbine oil now. It's a baseload turbine, and this oil has been in service from day one. And at that time, the end user installed an SBR filtration skid, a conditioning skid as well. So you can see what happens when you take this approach. You never have varnish problems. 9-10 years later, the fluid is still in like new condition. And this end user tops up their additives about 5% per year, not their additives, excuse me, their oil about 5% per year with new oil makeup. And in doing so, they've kept their additive levels quite robust as well. So when you take a look at the rate that their additives are depleting in this system, it's extremely slow. You would project over a 25-year lifespan for this oil based on its current rate of additive depletion. And clearly, acids and varnish are not accumulating in this system because they're being removed as they form. So this is the lowest risk profile that you can possibly have for operation of a turbine. So you would think sometimes that would be enough to sell people on this again. But again, it's like telling my kids to eat their broccoli. We know it's good for us, but we don't want to do it. We don't want to spend money on something up front because, well, I don't have a varnish problem today. Why would I spend that money today? Well, you end up achieving the lowest cost of operating profile by doing so as well. So we've just got a quick ROI calculation because money talks, I guess, and sometimes this is the most compelling argument that you can possibly take to management. So for this calculation, we're taking a look at a 7F turbine, 170 megawatts, so a reasonably large gas turbine. And we're taking a look at two different possible scenarios. One, no, in orange, in which we're not installing a conditioning skid. We're just, running the oil to failure, essentially. And in the right, when we do install a conditioning skid on day one, and we're doing true preventative maintenance here. Okay, so we're going to assume that this 7F turbine has about a 25-year lifespan. And on average, most gas turbine oils last 5 to 8 years, maybe 10 years if you're doing some things right. But 5 to 8 years is listed as being typical. I've seen ASTM actually lists 2 to 5 years as being typical, but that's not my experience when I speak to actual end users. So 25-year lifespan of a turbine. If you're going to get 8 years out of that turbine oil, you're going to need to refill it 3 times. You can figure out what the cost of that is. If you install a conditioning skid, you're going to save on some fills there because like we saw in the previous case study, you can potentially get a 25-year lifetime out of that oil if you treat it properly from day one. So some significant savings in terms of oil costs. Savings in terms of flushing. If you've got to dispose of your oil twice over the lifetime of the turbine, well, if you're paying good money for a new fill of oil, you probably want to make sure you're not carrying over contamination from the previous charge into that. So you should probably do a flush in between each fill. So that's 2 flushes over the lifetime of the oil at about 125K each. These aren't cheap. So you see, again, we have some significant savings associated with lifetime costs if you install a conditioning skid up front. Now, of course, this analysis is very one-sided right now because I've not shown the costs of the conditioning skid. So they're not dirt cheap. You're looking at an upfront CapEx, probably in the ballpark of about $30,000 for a turbine of this size. And it's not enough just to spend that CapEx up front. You have consumables costs. If you're not changing the ion exchange filters in that skid, well, eventually they're going to exhaust and they're as good as not. About $4,000 or $5,000 per year, so over the 25-year lifespan of that turbine, not insignificant, $112,500. You add up all those lifetime conditioning costs, and you calculate your ROI, and you still end up well ahead with the installation of an SBR skid, for instance, 316% ROI on the basis of oil lifetime extension alone. But where this really takes off is by preventing failures. And like we've seen, if you prevent varnish from ever accumulating in the fluid, you can prevent varnish problems. And for each of these problems that you prevent, there's a pretty significant savings that gets added up. So on a 7F turbine, we're going to assume a generating revenue of $40 per megawatt. I think that's actually conservative. But under that assumption, if the turbine trips, goes down for 24 hours, that ends up costing about $164,000 in lost revenues. If this happens even once per year for 25 years, that's over $4 million in lost revenues. So for each and every trip that you prevent, your ROI goes up. And say, for instance, you prevent one trip annually for the turbine's lifetime, your ROI increases from over 300% to 3,200%. So that's really where the cost pays back. It really pays back on lifetime extension to start, but even preventing one single trip will increase that ROI significantly. All right, so now that we've put the bottom line on it in terms of money, maybe we'll put the bottom line on it in terms of wrapping up today's talk, hopefully with some time for questions. As we've seen, the hydrocarbons that we're using in our oils, they're non-polar, but they break down to form polar products. And this is the general cause of widespread varnish problems. Like dissolve like, and those two are not alike. Now, traditionally, varnish has been defined as an insoluble deposit, and it's easy to understand why, because it's these insoluble deposits that you can actually see and that actually cause failures. So they get all the attention. But unfortunately, this definition and this approach ignores the soluble state of varnish, which, as we've seen, is very important. It has important implications on both varnish detection and varnish removal. So again, as an oil breaks down, we first form soluble varnish. It doesn't go right away to something that's going to stick to the valve and cause it to trip the turbine. That soluble varnish forms, it accumulates, and eventually it establishes an equilibrium with insoluble varnish. Insoluble and soluble varnish are shape shifters. They are in dynamic equilibrium with one another. And some of the implications of equilibrium chemistry here are that varnish that is dissolved at high temperatures, Le Chatelier's principle tells it that it will crash out as the oil cools. An important thing to consider here is your varnish removal strategy needs to address the impact that it will have on soluble-insoluble varnish equilibrium. We've seen how soluble varnish removal really effectively exploits that equilibrium. So varnish removal strategies, what can you do to reactively maintain your system, remove varnish, or better still, preventatively maintain it, keep varnish from ever forming? PAG cleaners, there's a time and a place for them, but unfortunately, they do really just kick the problem down the road. They defer problems, and buyer beware, they form varnish that you wouldn't have formed from the turbine oil on its own. You are adding chemical complexity to the system, and varnish is a chemically complex thing. It's a breakdown product, a mixture of breakdown products. The more complexity you add to a system, the more different ways things can potentially go sideways. So for short-term use, certainly a possible tool, a useful tool. Filtration, most common thing that I see done to remove varnish. It's a great idea. You're never going to go wrong with good filtration on your system. Having said that, with respects to varnish, it's a half solution because it leaves soluble and dissolved varnish behind. And with them behind, they can still deposit out elsewhere if the equilibrium takes a shift. ICB resin-based conditioning, soluble varnish removal. This is, in my opinion, the best tool for the job of removing varnish because you can remove varnish in both of its forms, soluble varnish directly, insoluble varnish indirectly. And you do this by exploiting that soluble-insoluble varnish equilibrium. And best practice here is not to do reactive maintenance, not to wait till you have a varnish problem and try to fix it. You can do that, it works, but best practice is to install one of these conditioning skids from day one, because again, you achieve the lowest cost of operating and the lowest risk profile by doing so. With that, I'd just like to wrap up by thanking you guys all for your attention. We kind of showed that picture of the mountains in the background behind Calgary on the start of the presentation. So I always like to finish my presentations by showing a picture a little closer up in the Rockies. Took this one on a hike with my dad this summer, a couple hours drive west of Calgary. Hope you guys all get a chance to come out and see the Rockies sometime because it is beautiful out here. And if you are in the neighborhood, please stop by and see us at EPT Clean Oil as well. We'd be more than happy to show you our beautiful Fluid Technical Center, take you on a tour of our facility. And right now, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that may have come in.
Thanks very much, Matt. That was great. There's a couple of questions that have come up in the chat room. I don't know if you're able to see that. If not, I can read them to you.
Sure.
So
Yeah, so I see first one here. Sorry, Ray, did you want to read them?
no, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Is EPT ICB used for FRFs as well as turbine lube oils? And the answer to that question is yes, but we would recommend a different ICB media for FRFs. FRFs are, of course, generally a phosphate ester-based fluid used as the hydraulic oil in steam turbines. And varnish is a problem there as well because that's your hydraulic control system. Valves are controlling the whole thing. You want to prevent varnish from forming. You got to use the right resin in order to do so. ICB resins, like I said, they've been specifically engineered. So we have a formulation that is unique for FRFs because FRFs are chemically unique. They therefore degrade in chemically different ways and form chemically unique varnish. I see next question from Ken Brown about needing varnish results quicker and not waiting for the 72 hours test time. Can you look for compounds using FTIR? In principle, you can. I would suggest from the data, a lot of the data that I've seen, I see really good correlations between FTIR oxidation levels, for instance, and acid number anyways. So you can probably just do acid testing in that instance. If you need the result quicker than 72 hours, it's not necessarily a result you can rely on, but you can certainly see if insoluble varnish is there, like we did see in that one case study. You can run it right through a patch then and there. And at the very least, you know, if insoluble varnish is present, there is also soluble varnish present. So that is a possibility there as well, Ken. Next up, Ken Brown as well. Will a PEG cleaner remove varnish from components, such as during a flush, or just go with an SVR system? Sorry, Ken, can you elaborate on that a little bit? I'm not quite sure I'm clear on what you're asking.
Okay, just had to unmute myself. No, the question there is if you do have varnish in your system, you're mentioning the SVR system will remove it over time. But I was just wondering if you were going to try to do it like doing a flush, if you had to do any oil changes because the fluid had degraded, would adding a PAG cleaner during a flush be of any benefit to clean the components in the system, like do actuators and the like?
Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying that I don't do flushes, but in my opinion, scientifically, yes, it would. The caveat being that PAG itself will likely break down and form breakdown products that you're going to want to be removed as well. So I would make sure that system is thoroughly flushed before the new charge of oil goes in it, because you don't want to have PAG residue left behind when you put in your new fill of oil. Another kind of just point that brings up too is that the PAG cleaner and soluble varnish removal system, the two don't have to be, adversarial. In fact, if the PAG brings insoluble varnish back into the oil, it will be removed by the SVR system as well. And we've seen this work at sites, but there is one issue associated with that, is that the PAGs allow oils to hold so much varnish sometimes that you can burn through a lot of ICB, ion exchange filters, if you choose to try and remove the varnish that you've resolubilized with a PAG. You're going to be changing your filters fast and furious. When you're done with it, the varnish will be gone, but you will burn through filters a lot faster if a PAG has been added to the oil. Seeing another question from a different Ken. Sorry, the chat just moved on me as somebody else came in there. MPC test measures soluble and insoluble varnish, correct? What's actually captured on that patch is by definition insoluble, but by letting the oil sample sit for 72 hours, some of the soluble varnish that is present, it converts to the insoluble form, and then you can capture it on the patch. We also use a non-polar solvent to kind of shock varnish that might have been on the edge of being soluble or insoluble, to shock the soluble varnish into an insoluble form, so you can see a little bit more of it. In the end, the MPC test does measure both, but it's really only measuring the soluble varnish if you do the 72-hour hold period. I see a question about electrostatic units. Are they similar to varnish filters? Electrostatic filtration, we sell electrostatic filters. They're incredibly useful in the right application. For varnish, they are not the best tool for the job because, like any other filtration, they rely on removing an insoluble. Electrostatics can remove insolubles that are much, much smaller than conventional filtration can, but they still only address insolubles. So you could take out ultrafine varnish particles with an electrostatic unit. You're not taking out soluble varnish. It's dissolved. It does not have mass per se, so it can't be deflected by an electrostatic field. Online MPC testing, is it unreliable? I would suggest that it is. I'm not aware of any online MPC test. Any sensor or anything like that is probably relying on FTIR oxidation, on capacitance of the oil, on oil color perhaps even, and it is using an established relationship between that property and MPC varnish potential. And it's probably using that kind of established relationship, which was made in a lab and is not always going to be representative of a field condition. So I would be cautious with respect to an MPC sensor or something like that per se, because it's not actually doing MPC testing, obviously. It can't be. There's a 72-hour hold time. Question from John. Any negatives to using an ICB SVR system other than perhaps the cost? Meaning that I can think of any, but is there any potential for negative side effects? There are potential risks to using ion exchange resins in a lubricant application. These can be mitigated by using resins that have been specifically engineered for lube oils. Ion exchange resins, they function on the basis of removing polar contaminants, but lube oils also contain polar additives. So there's not a risk of doing this with ICB because it's been engineered to leave the additives behind. And again, in an R&O application like a turbine, there is very little additives. So, it's not necessarily hard to engineer that, but you'll note that our resins aren't usually, they would never, for instance, be used in an engine oil application, which is much more highly additized. It would simply, it's simply much more difficult and I would suggest impossible to engineer a resin that would take out breakdown products exclusively in a much more highly additized fluid. In a system where all you're looking at is, a low level of amine or phenol antioxidant, maybe a little bit of AW additive, ZDDP or an ashless one, or a corrosion inhibitor. Again, things that are all present at very low levels. When you only have 3 or 4 things to think about, you can engineer the resin so that it's selective. The caution again is that are any other competing resins out there engineered to that degree? I would ask for assurances if you were considering using a different resin that's not ICB. Okay, and I have one last question at the bottom of the chat here. Is the 72-hour wait with MPC associated with an ASTM method? And the answer to that is yes. ASTM D7843 is the MPC test method, and it requires that 72-hour wait time, and it requires that any lab doing MPC testing report that 72-hour time along with the delta E. So I mentioned, if you're looking at your oil analysis report and you see a delta E result and no 72-hour result, make sure you're asking your lab about that. Call them out on it. They are not compliant with the ASTM method if they don't do that. I just see a little follow-up kind of there that I still haven't got to. When we did MPC testing going 10 to 12 years ago, we did it immediately, but clearly from what you've shown today, yes. And we had an example today that showed the difference that waiting 72 hours can make. That doesn't always happen. There are some systems, where the equilibria are different and where you don't see significant changes in the MPC result. But it happens often enough that in order to be able to count on your MPC result, in order for it to really be meaningful, to have confidence in that result, you need to wait the 72 hours. Another question coming in. if you remove insoluble varnish, does it not also try to create a new equilibrium so that the soluble turns insoluble to filter out? And that's a great question. That's one I've been waiting for a while, and that no one else has really caught. And intuitively, that makes sense, right? This equilibrium should be two-sided. You know, if I can pull the soluble varnish out and make the insoluble varnish redissolve, why can't I pull out the insoluble varnish and make the soluble varnish, you know, precipitate out? It doesn't work that way because these equilibrium changes, they depend not on changes in amount of varnish, so not in, you know, X kilograms of soluble varnish in the oil and X kilograms of insoluble varnish precipitated out. What drives equilibria like this are changes in concentration. So we got to look at kilograms per liter, for instance, to establish that. And the concentration of insoluble varnish will never change because it's a condensed state. So that concentration is a constant value. And since it doesn't change, even if you filter out half of the insoluble varnish that's present, the concentration of that insoluble varnish at the surface of the deposit where this equilibrium chemistry is going on, it hasn't changed. And if you're not changing the concentration, you're not changing or driving equilibria in any way. Soluble varnish, on the other hand, when you remove it, the concentration at the surface of the deposit where this, you know, reaction is going on, this conversion is going on, it does change. So we actually have on our website, EPT, or sorry, cleanoil.com, which you can see on the thank you slide if it's still up. On cleanoil.com, we have a resources section. And at this year's annual STLE meeting, which was virtual, unfortunately, but we did do a webinar on this very topic, talking about KSP, which is a solubility product, getting into some of the chemistry of equilibria here in more depth than we presented today, and explaining why when you don't take out, or when you take out soluble varnish, it doesn't have the same effect. So if I did not answer that question adequately here in the couple of minutes allowed to me, there's a 25-minute presentation on our website talking about that in the resources section. And please feel free to send me an email as well. I can send you the link.
So I don't see any further questions in the chat. So does anybody have any further questions for Matt quickly before we wrap this up? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Matt, for your presentation. That was great. Just for your information, this presentation was recorded, and Bashad is going to upload it to the STLE Toronto YouTube channel. So if anybody has missed it and would like to see it, you'll be able to go onto the STLE Toronto section YouTube channel to view it. And I guess with that, if there's nothing further, thank you very much again, everyone, and you have a great day.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.